Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here with Laura Delano, the author of the new book, Unshrunk. Oh dear. Oh, there we go. And man, it's an incredible story about her story of psychiatric treatment resistance. Now, there's a double meaning there. After having read it, she did overcome many years in the psychiatric industrial complex, or whatever you want to call it, after being diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the age of 13. Um, and well, I guess I'm lucky enough to have Laura here. I'll just ask you to, give us a summary about your story, and then we can get into, some of the media reaction to this, which I always think is interesting. As a bit of a media critic myself, that's usually a signal, as you noted yourself, that you're doing something right.
Yeah, well, Matt, thanks so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this. It's gonna be fun. I mean, in a nutshell, I was an angry, intense, despairing, self-injuring 13-year-old girl who had parents who felt just totally overwhelmed by what was happening. And, God bless them. It was the only visible thing they saw before them. Was to send me to a mental health professional. So this was back in the mid 90s. And that began what I like to call my 14-year relationship with the American mental health industry. And, you know, eventually it took a little while, but I um, you know, right out the gates, basically was told I was bipolar, as you said, that my anger and my irritability and my outbursts were symptoms of mania, and my despair and all the dark stuff I was feeling and thinking were symptoms of depression. Um, and I was told this in the span of an hour by a psychiatrist, literally never met her before, and was put on promptly on mood stabilizer called Depakote that to this day is still not approved for use in children for psychiatric reasons. And Prozac, which at the time was not approved for kids. Um, and yeah, I did resist it at first. I knew it didn't make sense to label me the defective one because I was kind of waking up to all the problems in the environment around me, wondering like why is school set up the way it's set up? Why are we all programmed to get good grades and perform? Like, what does it all mean? This is all, just we're just robots. I just was having these deep kind of existential questions, but I didn't have any place to talk about them in. I didn't see anyone else talking about them, so it makes sense that I eventually ended up in front of a psychiatrist. So I by the time I was 18, I bought into the whole thing. I go into it in the book, how I eventually reached that point. And from 18 to 27, I was a professional psychiatric patient. Basically, it became my life's purpose to be compliant, to do what my doctor said, to take my meds as prescribed, to track my symptoms, to make sure I was basically prioritizing, like, managing my illness. And the better I got at managing my illness and being a patient, the smaller and smaller and smaller my life became. And the more physically sick and socially isolated and completely, disabled, basically, I became. And we were told every step of the way that this was just me getting sicker. So unfortunate. This bipolar disorder is really severe. Eventually, it was declared treatment resistant, hence the name of my book. And as you said, it definitely has a double meaning. And when I was told that I was just so sick that all of these treatments just can't make a dent in your disease, the message that sent me was basically I was fucked. Like, I've tried everything, all these top doctors and these top hospitals, because I happened to be born in a family who could send me to really good care. They've tried it all. All that's in store for me is just more dysfunction. hospitals, not being able to take care of myself, being dependent on my family. Like, what's the point in being alive anymore? And so I eventually decided to kill myself. And to this day, I'm like, I think it makes sense that I made that decision because of the story I was believing about my life and what my life held for me. To fast forward, it took another couple of years, but eventually some events transpired that basically woke me up from all of this. And so while my book goes into all that dark psychiatrization, as I like to put it, to me, the part that's the most important is how I actually woke up from all of it and eventually came off the drugs and kind of discovered myself for the first time beyond being a psychiatric patient.
Man, I have to read from the DSM and how it summarizes bipolar disorder.
Please do. I'd love to hear it again.
Yeah. All right. So here we go. This is straight from the DSM-5. Is that the most recent, or is there a...
Yeah, 5TR, I think, is like the most official, newest version.
Okay.
Yeah.
It says, and this is the Bible for psychiatry, right? And you explain, in great detail, like a little bit about the history, who this is, even who makes these decisions. So bipolar disorder is individuals but with bipolar disorder may have increased activity, poor concentration, and increased impulsivity, but these features are episodic, occurring several days at a time. Oh no. In bipolar disorder, increased impulsivity or inattention is accompanied by elevated mood, grandiosity, and other specific bipolar features. Children with ADHD may show significant changes in mood within the same day. Changes in mood within the same day? What? I mean, when I stub my toe, it takes me a whole week to react to that. Let's see. Such liability is distinct from a manic episode, which must last 4 or more days to be a clinical indicator of bipolar disorder. 4 days, guys. Yes, something traumatic happens, and you think about it for 4 days or more, you would be diagnosed accurately as having bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is rare in pre-adolescence, even when severe irritability and anger are prominent, whereas ADHD is common among children and adolescents who display excessive anger and irritability. All right. That's a summary. Your reaction to that, Laura?
I mean, it's a very creative work of fiction, in the sense that, how the DSM came to be is, to put it succinctly, a group of psychiatrists essentially sitting around and kind of deciding what to call a symptom of a particular diagnosis, and then just basically inventing it and describing it subjectively, because of course, what do all those words mean? I mean, basically every single word you just described is a subjective word. Elevated or irritable or grandiosity. I mean, what that means to one person means something completely different to someone else. And so, I think when you realize that this book that sits at the heart of not just the psychiatric profession, but all diagnosing professions, it's what is, the managed care industry is built around it. So billing and coverage of your so-called care is built around these diagnoses. The research enterprise, historically within the National Institute of Mental Health has largely been built on these diagnoses. When you realize how massive the scale is of the industry that has been built up around this book that lacks reliability and validity as a which are two factors that for a text to be considered scientific needs to meet the criteria for both of these things, and it has neither. Like basically reliability means in a nutshell that multiple clinicians would diagnose the same thing in the same person. It does not have, it lacks that. Clinicians give different diagnoses depending on their own subjective opinions and on the subjective expression of the person they're diagnosing, and then validity in the sense that the diagnosis you're giving actually measures something real that you can kind of confirm is being measured. So whereas you could be, diagnosed with hypothyroidism because they've decided that this particular range of, TSH is pathological. Like, okay, so you fit in 0.4 to 4, you have hypothyroidism. There's nothing measurable. And you could make a case like, is that also subjective too? But I'll put that to the side. There's just nothing measurable here that you can actually confirm and validate is accurately being diagnosed in the first place. So, for me, one of the things I've spent years thinking about is, why did it never occur to me to step back and ask questions about this book that I treasured? I mean, I bought myself a copy and it was like $240. Crazy how much money it costs. And it's copyright APA, American Psychiatric Association. I would study it. I would actually read it so that I could better understand myself and track my symptoms. Never once did I stop and wonder, how did this book come to be? I just assumed they must have done serious science somewhere, laboratories. And I think that's a question that our culture needs to ask more here. Like when you are told you have a chemical imbalance and you accept that, why doesn't it occur to you to be like, how do you know that? You haven't looked in my brain.
Yeah, they're not doing biology. They're not doing chemistry in the therapy office, right? Let me extract some of that brain liquid, and we're gonna measure the anyway. So, I mean, you gave a brief summary of how this all started. You were, 13 and had I think a pretty common experience of a 13-year-old, right? I mean, that is a time where you have these new experiences. You're experiencing things you haven't experienced before, and naturally, you're gonna feel some anxiety and all this stuff. But to treat anxiety, it's like, well, alcohol is known to treat anxiety, to treat depression. Ecstasy is known to treat depression, to make you happy. But we don't recommend these things to people. But if a doctor can just slap a Pfizer label, if a Pfizer label is on these drugs, these pills, then all of a sudden it's all good and dandy. It's even holy. It's become a new religion, which I thought you did a good job describing in your book. Can you talk on that a bit?
Well, I think you're raising a really important point around just our relationship to psychoactive chemicals generally as a species. I mean, human beings have been altering ourselves since the dawn of time, or close to it, with psychoactive chemicals. And so a lot of this is about the language that we use to talk about these substances. And so just as you said, someone, could have a glass of wine and feel helped, less anxious. No one is doing that thinking like, oh, I have some deficiency in my body and alcohol is a medicine that's treating that, and that's why I feel better. People know when you are in a relationship with alcohol that you're drinking a psychoactive liquid that is going to disrupt your central nervous system function in a way that might feel helpful to you, at least for a time. And so I think the fact that when it comes to psychiatric medications, so to speak, because we have this medicalized language, we call them medicine, we call them medication, we call the states that we're in illnesses, conditions, disorders. Those words are, at the heart of the meaning that we make of what these drugs are. And I think that's where the distorting effect really comes in, because when you're swallowing a pill that you believe is a medicine treating some kind of pathology in you, that's a profoundly different experience than when you're swallowing a pill that isn't fixing anything wrong with you, but is having an effect on you that you might find beneficial. You're going to be in relationship to those pills in very different ways based on how you're making sense of what each is. And so I think this is a really important piece of this bigger conversation that our society really needs to start having about the so-called mental health crisis that we're in. Because I know for me, as long as I was viewing myself through this medicalized lens, and I was viewing these drugs through this, in this medicinal way, I was really interfering with my own innate capacity to move through what I was in, to actually believe that I had the capacity to change and evolve and grow myself. All of these important life lessons that not that long ago, like pre-modernity human beings would grapple with over the course of their lives. I missed out on a lot of that because I was just so consumed by this medicalized, kind of pharmaceuticalized way of making sense of myself and what it means to be human.
You mentioned that this is obviously a conversation we need to be having, just this other side of the conversation, like, maybe we should think twice about, putting these kids and adults on these mind-altering drugs. But it is a conversation that has been happening for a while. It's just that it gets squashed and attacked at every turn. One example, which you cited early on in your book, was the studies of Irving Kirsch, who's a Harvard professor, who found that these antidepressants were not more effective than placebos. And of course, when you consider the potential harmful side effects of the drugs, like, well, then clearly this is something we should be paying attention to. And it did get some attention on 60 Minutes, and I'm going to play that clip now for everybody. Let's see.
The medical community is at war, battling over the scientific research and writings of a psychologist named Irving Kirsch. The fight is about antidepressants and Kirsch's questioning of whether they work. Kirsch's views are of vital interest to the 17 million Americans who take the drugs, including children as young as 6, and to the pharmaceutical industry that brings in $11.3 billion a year selling them. Irving Kirsch is the Associate Director of the Placebo Studies Program at Harvard Medical School, and he says that his research challenges the very effectiveness of antidepressants.
The difference between the effect of a placebo and the effect of an antidepressant is minimal for most people.
So you're saying if they took a sugar pill, they'd have the same effect?
They'd have almost as large an effect, and whatever difference there would be clinically insignificant.
But people are getting better taking antidepressants. I know them.
Oh, yes.
We all know them.
The people get better when they take the drug, but it's not the chemical ingredients of the drug that are making them better. It's largely the placebo effect.
Kirsch, who's been studying placebos for 36 years, says sugar pills can work miracles.
Placebos are great for treating a number of disorders: irritable bowel syndrome, repetitive strain injuries, ulcers, Parkinson's disease.
Even traumatic knee pain. In this clinical trial, some patients with osteoarthritis underwent knee surgery, while others had their knees merely opened and then sewn right back up.
And here's what happened. In terms of walking and climbing, the people who got the placebo actually did better
Come on.
than the people who got the real surgery.
No.
And that lasted for a year. At 2 years after surgery, there was no difference at all between the real surgery and the sham surgery.
Is it all in your head, or?
Well, it's not all in your head, because the placebos can also affect your body. So if you take a placebo tranquilizer, you're likely to have a lowering of blood pressure and pulse rate. Placebos can decrease pain, and we know that's not all in the mind also, because we can track that using neuroimaging in the brain as well.
Anyway, so I had to include that surgery part because I think that's just incredible. Man. And anyway, so this is real thorough science that this guy did. Like the segment goes on, and maybe I'll play it, but the where he, like, so how, well, Laura, you want to explain, like, how did he figure this all out?
Well, he and his co-authors basically went back and reviewed, did a comprehensive review of basically all the literature on antidepressant efficacy, going back, I think, into the 70s at some point, to really systematically assess, like, how when we're told that X drug is effective, you know, what does that actually mean in the context of the drug versus the placebo? And basically, and they did this several times over the course of maybe 10 or 15 years, with each time expanding the scope of the studies that they were looking at, because they were getting a lot of pushback from the psychiatric community that they weren't doing these analyses properly. They were, you know, kind of like, whether it was, you know, kind of, basically they were being accused of looking at, oh, you were just looking at people who weren't severely depressed. And so, so they would return to do it again and again in response to all of these critiques that they were getting. And time again, they found the same thing, which is basically that there's no clinically significant difference most of the time for people on the actual drug versus the placebo. And in the instance where there is some kind of difference, because they did find a small percentage of people had like slightly more significant benefit from the drug, there was no kind of pattern, or there was no way to basically figure out which kind of person would have the benefit. And they proposed that a big part of why they were even having these benefits in the first place was a phenomenon called broken blinding, which basically means when you are in a placebo group, or when you enter into a study as a participant, and it's explained to you, you know, if you're in the drug group, blah, blah, blah. If you're in the placebo group, blah, blah, blah. People could kind of figure out, like, oh, okay, I'm not actually having any adverse effects, no dry mouth, or no this, or no that. So this is this phenomenon called broken blinding, where the people who are on placebo kind of figure out that they are. So, so that's obviously going to affect how much benefit they feel if they realize they're not actually on the drug. So this Kirsch's work, I think, is really important in calling into question this like deep faith that our culture has in antidepressants. And, you know, one thing that I think is that he doesn't really get into in his work, others focus more on this, is the fact that even if, let's take for granted that the placebo effect is powerful with antidepressants, they do also have real effects on the brain and body as well. They are not, because they are not sugar pills. They're very potent, most often serotonergic drugs. Some of them act on other neurotransmitter systems as well. And they do have real effects. And so I think it's possible that for many people who feel helped by an antidepressant, you know, maybe part of it is placebo, but part of it might actually be the direct drug effects. But these effects aren't what these drugs are marketed to us as. The effects are usually things like numbing, or kind of dulling of your emotions, or, you know, kind of disconnecting you from yourself. And that can feel helpful for some people sometimes, but that help isn't coming from a symptom being treated. It's coming from a direct kind of downing, sedating, numbing effect on the body. And so then the question becomes like, okay, so, what are the trade-offs there? Like, do I want to numb myself? Do I want to dull my thoughts? Maybe I feel less despair, but does that also mean I feel less connected to other people or connected to a sense of joy, or gratitude or whatever it might be? And one thing too, and then I'll stop talking because I get so excited talking about all this stuff.
No, please.
One really important piece of this puzzle as well, besides the placebo effect, is the length of the drug trials themselves.
Ooh,
across all drug classes, because and you'll know this from having read my book, but for anyone out there who's not super familiar with the kind of research literature that gets these drugs approved by the FDA in the first place, the average length of a psychiatric drug trial that gets submitted to the FDA to prove safety and efficacy is about 6 to 8 weeks. Most of us take these drugs for months or years. I certainly did. And so even if, there's a case to make that beyond the placebo effect, some people feel helped by these drugs for a certain length of time, like, what does that mean for the long game here, though, for that person? Because there is no evidence base for safety or effectiveness over the long term. And if you're basically doing a giant experiment on yourself here, on the population at large, and there's quite a strong case to make that there are serious adverse effects that can emerge from using these drugs for any length of time. Is it worth it? Is that numbing worth it? This isn't me saying no. Like, to be clear, I am about informed choice. I'm not anti-drug, but people need to know all of this up front before they make that decision for themselves. And of course, most of us, perhaps all of us, are not being informed at this level which we need to be to actually be making true choices here.
Yeah. Oh, and that's what, and it pisses me off when, outlets like the Washington Post will like accuse you of being anti-expert or anti-science when you really dig into the science more than these reviewers did. Way more. Like, they didn't mention any of that. They don't mention the just another detail of this Irving Kirsch research is that he had to file FOIA requests to see all those trials, those unsuccessful trials that the drug companies had done. And what's incredible is it's going to be mind-blowing for everybody, but while reading your book, I see, and as Irving Kirsch explained, it only takes two successful studies, which means the drug has some effect over a placebo, no matter how minor. And then, then they can go to market. But it doesn't matter if it's just 2 studies in 100 studies, 100 other studies that showed it failed, that were done by the same drug company. Just think about how crazy that is, everyone.
Oh no, did I lose my camera?
It's so crazy that it literally blew Laura's camera into glass shards. So,
hold on.
It's okay.
Sorry about this. Give me a sec.
It's okay. You can figure that out. I will try. I will just go on my rant with the FDA and their relationship, their cozy relationship with the drug companies.
And yeah, it's. I do think. Okay, I may need to get the technical assistance of my husband here, because I don't know why my...
No problem at all. What I'm going to do is I am going to play the segment or the part of that 60-minute segment that goes into what I just explained
Perfect.
a little more.
Great. And then we should be resolved by then.
Cool.
Whether they work,
Parkinson's disease,
Here we go. All right.
even
Here we go. Yeah, remember how they explain placebos work better or as well as the antidepressants? And here's
actually did better
come on.
than the people who got the real surgery.
No.
and
that
surgery. Incredible.
well, it's not all in your head, not all in the mind.
There we go.
Also, because we can track that using neuroimaging in the brain as well.
Come on.
Really?
Kirsch was so surprised by his initial findings, he decided to do a second study using data not only from the drug company's clinical trials that had been published in medical journals. This time, he got data that weren't published but had been submitted to the FDA, which he got through the Freedom of Information Act.
These are the studies that showed no benefit of the antidepressant over the placebo. What they did is they took the more successful studies, they published most of them, they took their unsuccessful studies, and they didn't publish them.
So when you did your study, you put all the trials together.
That's right.
You're looking at patients who took the real drug and patients who took the placebo.
Yes.
Did they get equally better? Or did the ones who took the pills get even a little better?
If they were mildly or moderately depressed, you don't see any real difference at all. The only place where you get a clinically meaningful difference is at these very extreme levels of depression.
Now look, psychiatrists say Kirsch and his studies have triggered a furious counterattack, mainly from psychiatrists who are lining up to defend the use of antidepressants, like Dr. Michael Thace, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, who has been a consultant to many of the drug companies.
Yep. And that's how it goes. You people like Kirsch, they stumble upon this incredible damning information. It's just absolutely damning for the drug companies that they were hiding all these studies that showed the exact opposite of what they're, claiming the drug can do. And then, they bring in these experts who are funded or their research is funded by the drug companies.
Yeah.
And Blur's back. Woohoo. All right.
Can you hear me okay too? Everything look and sound like I'm here?
Look and sound good. Yeah, you tap on that mic. Let's see if that's coming through. Yeah. Oh, beautiful. All right. Yep.
Yeah, it's once you peel the first kind of onion layer of this whole enterprise, you realize just how kind of vast the corruption, the regulatory capture, the entire kind of knowledge construction and dissemination architecture is from day one of medical school, where you have a well-meaning young budding doctor coming in wanting to help people who are suffering. They're instantly immersed in textbooks that are ghost written by drug company employees. They're learning in laboratories that are funded by industry. Their professors are funded by industry. And I think it's, I grew up in a family and a kind of like cultural environment that was just very unquestioning of medical authority. And so it really only, it's only been in this journey of waking up from my psychiatrization that I've kind of connected with these broader kind of structural and systemic issues here at play here that are not just in the realm of psychiatry, but across so much of the health industry, that are, not necessarily putting the well-being of citizens first, to put it mildly.
Yeah. Gosh. And people Post tries to say like, oh, and you're helping other people with your husband try to go on the same successful journey you went on. and overcoming your reliance on these drugs. Now, not that you ever needed them, but that you were suffering withdrawal symptoms. And this is something that is so important for people to understand, and so many people don't understand. And that is that, typically, well, first of all, the Post said something, or maybe it was the New York Times article. They said that it's misleading. Hold on, I'm just going to quote. They say a section of antipsychotics, for instance, cites study in one of your old blogs, states that a section on antipsychotics, for instance, cites studies that purport to show that people who take them fare worse than people who never take them or stop them. And then it goes in parentheses, New York Times, this is misleading. People do not take them unless they have severe symptoms. What the? How the hell can you make that ridiculous claim? I know people who tell me their therapist was just like, just like that, just like your experience, just an hour, not even an hour of seeing them, and they were already writing the prescription for antipsychotics.
Yeah, well, and this drug class in particular, and just before we go further into it, even the word antipsychotic, I mean, that's marketing language. That's not scientific. That's not a scientific name for this drug class. They don't act against psychosis. They're tranquilizers. In the 1950s, when these drugs first came to market, they were called tranquilizers. And, at least the profession just called them what they were, how they actually acted on the body. So even the word antipsychotic, is so misleading, because these are sedating, tranquilizing drugs that often are interfering primarily with the dopaminergic system, and they're used, especially Seroquel in particular, is used off-label. Millions of people are prescribed this drug off-label for sleep. And interestingly enough, some of these so-called antipsychotics have also been repurposed as what they call adjunct antidepressants. So some of you may have seen, I mean, I don't have a TV, so I haven't seen one of these commercials in a while, but you may, in the past 10 years have seen a drug ad for basically saying, are you on an antidepressant and it's not working? You don't feel less depressed. Well, here's some great news. We have a new drug that's an adjunct antidepressant that you take in addition to your existing antidepressant to help amplify the beneficial effects of these drugs. They don't tell you this is actually a repurposed antipsychotic that was about to go off patent. And so in order to continue their patent, they had to come up with a new use for it. And of course, also, it's like, hello, they're admitting right here in the drug ad that these drugs don't work. So rather than take another one, how about we all pause here for a minute, be like, maybe there's a different path to head down here. So yeah, I mean, that New York Times feature, while it's a big deal that they're acknowledging to some minimal degree that withdrawal from these drugs is a real issue. There were a lot of factual errors in it, some citing of sources that are just completely biased, like industry sources. And then just a lot of interesting claims made that didn't really have any evidence to back them at all. But I do think this issue of withdrawal is so important, especially in our current cultural moment where more people than ever before, I would argue, having been at this for 15 years, are beginning to question their relationship to these drugs. We need to make sure that people understand that taking these drugs, all classes of psychiatric drugs, antidepressants, benzodiazepines, mood stabilizers, antipsychotics, stimulants, Z drugs, all of them across the board, if you take them for any length of time, your central nervous system may well become physically dependent on this drug. This is different than addiction in the sense that you're not craving the drug and kind of knowing that you're taking it even though it's causing you harm, which is the kind of classic definition of addiction. It's purely physiological. The human body is oh no. Why does this keep happening? Well, you know what? Maybe my
You can
camera's
keep-
overheating. I'm going to switch to, let me see here. Why don't I switch to a less nice but quicker to? Yeah, they got me again in the comments. They're
Yeah, that's right.
Let me see here. I'm going to change.
Don't you dare talk back to the Washington Post
This
and New
has
York
never happened
Times.
before. This has never happened before, I will say. So, and I do a lot of these. So let me see. This is going to be a different view.
Cool.
This is from my computer now, but is this okay? Can
Oh
you?
yeah.
Okay?
Yeah,
okay.
that's great.
So when you take any psychiatric medication for any length of time, the human body is designed for a state of homeostasis. So if you're taking a psychoactive chemical like a psychiatric drug repeatedly every single day for weeks or months, and certainly years, your whole central nervous system, your whole body is going to acclimate to the presence of this foreign chemical. It's going to change itself. It's going to change its structure, how it functions to accommodate for the presence of this drug. And so when you remove this drug, especially if you remove it too quickly, that is, your body's not just going to snap right back to how it was before you were ever exposed to it. You're going to basically be faced with a potentially, vast array of problems, physical, mental, emotional, sexual, cognitive, that are symptoms of withdrawal. And so the challenge, the way our mental health industry is currently set up, because there's a lack of awareness of this, because doctors and therapists are not taught about this, generally speaking, or accurately, I should say, they're not taught about it in graduate schools. There's no kind of like official endorsement of this as a real problem. A lot of people, when they try to come off their meds and they feel horrible, think they're having a relapse, quote unquote, where their doctors are telling them that they're having a relapse. See, you came off your Lexapro and you feel horrible. Now, do you understand why you need to take your Lexapro? This is your baseline untreated depression here. Is this really how you want to feel? So I think a lot of people stay on these drugs for years because every time they try to come off, they feel horrible and they're being told this is a relapse. And so I think it's really important. And I know through our nonprofit, Inner Compass Initiative, and just in my work as much as I possibly can, I want to really help spread the word about the fact that these drugs do cause physical drug dependence. They can cause withdrawal symptoms. We don't know exact numbers. This is not a well-studied area, but surveys indicate that it's quite a high percentage of people who go through withdrawal symptoms, sometimes for not just days or weeks, but months or even years. And so we need to really focus on this as a serious crisis here, because if more and more people want to come off of these drugs they've realized they don't want to take, they need to be aware of not just the risk of withdrawal, but also, okay, so how do I taper safely then? Which is really most of what our nonprofit is all about. And, we provide free, the New York Times article kind of to put it nicely, didn't accurately capture what it is that we do. 99.5% of what we offer is free for people. We have free information about the drugs themselves, about how to taper off them safely. We have a self-directed step-by-step tapering manual where you can literally teach yourself with pictures how to make a liquid mixture out of your Lexapro if you want to reduce in teeny tiny amounts. And we have a mutual aid community where people are helping each other navigate the withdrawal journey, because there's no help on offer right now. No safe, supportive, compassionate help on offer right now from the mental health system for how to get off of these drugs. It just doesn't exist. No guidelines for tapering, no recognition of the need for this. It's a huge issue. And we lay people have basically had to figure it out for ourselves, how to taper off safely, and then provide the support to one another to actually do it, because for a lot of people, the mental health system doesn't even acknowledge that this is a real thing, let alone support them through it.
Yeah. I'll bring up the let's see. This is another review. That was hold on, let me pull, there we go. That was criticizing you for there we go. For being anti-expert. But as you said, the so-called experts, they are not familiar with, with tapering, and or even that with these drugs cause withdrawal symptoms, which are because they are under the impression that those are symptoms of a mental disorder and evidence that you need to stay on the drugs or be prescribed new drugs or more drugs. Mm-hmm. It's so wild. And it's so important for people to hear stories like yours, because just, imagine, and right, I mean, you're not in any way criticizing people who are on the antidepressants. Just think how vulnerable a patient is going in, and a doctor prescribes them these drugs, because once that happens, whether it seems like it has a positive effect, whether your symptoms get better or not, you're screwed either way. If they get better, it's going to attribute it to the drug. Even though, and if it gets worse, well, you need more drugs. You need a higher dosage or another drug. So what was that?
That's when you're treatment resistant. You're just so sick that our wonderful drugs can't work their magic on you. So
what an incredible term. You mentioned the language of the industry and how deceptive it is. That's another great example. And another one you explained was how the DSM originally referred to depression as depressive reaction and schizophrenic reaction. And then it became, in later editions, depressive disorder or a neuroses, and then disorder. And it's just turning normal, at least in many cases. I'm super convinced, and I think more and more people are understanding that they are turning totally normal human experiences into mental illnesses.
Yeah, and even because sometimes when critics hear that kind of message, they're turning normal human experiences into mental illnesses, which I completely agree with, by the way. People will then say, oh yeah, well, what about these severe, really psychotic, manic, crazy people who are doing dangerous things? And, all well and good for you to say that they're over medicalizing and over diagnosing, the normal spectrum of human emotions, but there are some people who are really, really sick. What do you have to say about them? And I would make the case that even in these extreme cases, and I know I have many friends who have serious mental illness diagnoses, like I once did, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, friends who hear voices, friends who've had really extreme beliefs that are completely outside of consensus reality. I would argue that even in these more extreme cases, we still don't have any kind of a strong evidence base to claim that these are illnesses in the brain. Obviously, biology is real. Our experience of reality is mediated through our biology. Every emotion we feel, every thought we think, every behavior we do is in some way mediated through our bodies. So this isn't me saying there's no biological reality here. Of course there is. But this idea that someone who is maybe hearing voices and, convinced of a really powerful delusion of some kind, that the reason they're having these experiences is because there's pathology in their brain. And in rare circumstances, there could be a brain tumor that is causing hallucinations. You could have late stage Lyme disease or syphilis. I mean, there are actual real pathologies that can cause distorted perceptions of reality, but you would see a neurologist for those conditions. Those are actual neurological conditions that have a measurable lesion or otherwise abnormality, like a tumor or whatever it is. And a lot of times there is no, actual pathology at all. And people just, they're all, I'm not one of these reductionist people who thinks, oh, it's not mental illness, it's trauma, or it's this, or it's that. I mean, it's so fucking complicated and complex to be human. There's, especially in this modern world that we live in, that is designed in so many ways in like an anti-human way. But I think to just assume all the time that someone who's a severe case, well, they really are mentally ill. I think I would really push back against that and say, whether, like, there's always a story behind it. There's always, if you ask, like, what's happened in this person's life, what's happened to this person, what needs has this person had that have not been met, or what things have happened to this person that shouldn't have happened. There's always a story that, if you take the time to actually kind of unpack it and think it through, that makes you realize it's so much more complicated here than just saying, oh, too bad they're hallucinating. There's just some chemical imbalance. Here's an antipsychotic.
This made me think of a quote from your book, which I thought was pretty powerful. And also, I mean, is definitely going to piss a lot of people off. But you said, oh God, there's so many. Let's see. Which one do I want to start with? Okay. You said therapy was also my only reliable, if fleeting, source of self-forgiveness. I craved the weekly reminder that I was doing the best I could, that I was fundamentally slutty or selfish or entitled or evil, that because of how sick I was, none of what I did was my fault. I don't recall any therapist ever holding me accountable for my actions, or calling bullshit on my justifications, or challenging me to take even a little bit of responsibility for myself. Had one of them, I probably would have gotten offended and found a replacement, which would have benefited neither of us.
That was a fun section to write.
God, yeah, I mean, yeah, how did that come about? Because, yeah, how'd you go? I mean, there's just so much to that. It's so deep. I think it's true. But obviously defenders of the industry and, current patients will be very insulted by that.
Yeah. And I feel for them. I mean, I often think about, I often put myself back in the shoes of who I was, 15, 16 years ago. And it's like, how would that me back then feel about what I'm saying right now or what I'm writing right now? And yeah, I would have been hurt. I would have felt invalidated. I would have felt insulted and outraged. And so I feel for the pissed off people right now who are just outraged that my book exists. And just to be clear, this is not me saying that all therapy is bad and all therapists are useless, but in my experience, and I do think in the experience of many, many, many people, especially young people, the therapy industry, like the kind of psychiatric industry, has really claimed a monopoly on what constitutes help in our society. And we have devalued, I think, to a great degree, the power of mutual aid, the power of neighbor to neighbor support, the power of basic friendship, and instead kind of all just insidiously slipped into this, or I shouldn't say all, but just large numbers of us have kind of come to equate legitimate help with a service you pay for from a professional. Because I'm not a professional. You're feeling suicidal. I can't help. I'm not a professional, call a crisis line or go to the emergency room. And so I think the power we have given to mental health professionals to kind of own the territory of help has meant that there's been this like insidious creep of the kind of a therapeuticized culture over the past 10, 15 years. I mean, it really has exploded. Even in the time that I've been an ex-patient doing this work, I've watched this like therapy culture become cool. You know, I think it was just starting. I was the very beginnings, you know, as an elder millennial, like I was the beginnings of this. Now it's just, if you don't have a therapist, like you're not cool. And the only way you can feel seen and heard in your pain is if you're in therapy and you're on meds. And so I do remember how powerful it was to go to my doctor, because I happened to be getting my meds, quote unquote meds, and therapy from the same psychiatrist. So I was seeing, which isn't that common anymore. I think most people have like a monthly med visit with their psychopharm for 15 minutes. And then they have a separate therapist. Mine was a one-stop shop. And just how much I craved being able to go in there and just pour out everything on my mind and feel so seen and understood, because I had the rest of my life was so devoid of meaningful connection and meaningful support. And I do think this is like for young people, especially, we've so lost touch with the power that we have to help one another, including through serious crises, like feeling suicidal. The fact that people think I can't be with someone who's suicidal, to me is just a great travesty that we're so out of touch with our own power to be with one another in the midst of great, terrifying pain. So yeah, I know that's a threatening message to a lot of people, and I don't mean it that way. I mean it really more as an invitation. Like, if your therapy is really helpful for you and you are moving through things, you're growing and evolving, like, all the power to you. But if you just like go to therapy so that you can just feel validated and have a place to talk about your problems, like, how is that truly serving you? I think we need to ask ourselves that more often, but from a place of compassion, not judgment, because I totally get why so many people are in this situation, like as I was, because I was once there too. I get it.
Yeah. And I mean, one reason people are so resistant. First, I'll just say, just an example of how it's become like so cool and popular and almost like a badge of courage. Like, just to, I have a mental illness, and so it's like a source of pride, even, partly because it's like an excuse. At least your insight, I agree with, excuse to like, oh, I'm not responsible. It's my mental illness. Anything I do that's that's bad. Or so unlike you got your congratulations on your relationship with your husband, who does this same important work. I have been single, and I've gone on the dating apps, and it is mind blowing. I swear to God, it's a theme. It's a common theme to see girls say, just as they would list like a Christian person, or would want to say only Christians or only Jewish or only Muslim. Like, it's like, don't contact me if you don't believe in therapy, if you're not seeing a therapist. I swear to God.
Really?
Yep. DC area, super common. It is wild.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
And these are is this like 20, 30, some, like, what age range is this?
Yeah. Yeah. That's 20s and 30s. Yeah.
It's really, it's amazing how ubiquitous, it's almost like it's become a signifier of you being a like on top of yourself in your life. Like, and therefore if you don't have a therapist, like, oh, you're clearly like lacking insight into your you must think you don't have any problems, which is like a red flag,
Yeah. Or that you're lacking some kind of morality. Like, if you're not, don't belong to a certain religion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or you're, a denier of, the science. You just can't have just because that's like saying like, oh, because you're not religious yourself, that you're not, just because you're not Muslim, oh, that you hate Muslims,
Yeah. There is, it is, and as you mentioned, like I kind of talk about this in my book. I do think there is a religious, there's a powerful ideology at the heart of all of this that I would argue is religious in nature, in the sense that you are putting your faith in something that you are not, you're taking for granted what you're being told, therefore putting your faith in this, and you're at the same time saying, I'm turning my life over to you. You have what I need. I don't have what I need. I can't be fully me without you. And, and I won't ask any questions, because asking questions indicates that I, lack, that I'm like even sicker than I realize. And that's actually, besides the treatment resistance piece and the kind of vicious cycle of withdrawal that gets mistaken as relapse, the other really insidious loop that people get stuck in is that when you start to question psychiatric authority, they use that to further pathologize you and further justify keeping you enmeshed in their treatments, because asking questions of what they're doing indicates that you're extra sick. You're so sick you don't even realize how sick you are.
Yeah.
And so there, I think, as I talk about in the book, like for a period of time after coming off all the drugs and trying to like kind of get through the early years of that, I started to think about like, where does my story fit? What genre, so to speak, is this a story? Like, where does this belong? Because it's not a mental health memoir or mental illness memoir. It's not a mental health recovery memoir. And I eventually realized, as I go into in the book, like the best genre I think I fit into is like cult memoir, where I believe so deeply in this powerful ideology through the most formative years of my life. And I turned my life over to it. And then I woke up and realized, holy shit, what was that? And I left it, and then like tried to pick up the pieces. Like, what were those 14 how did that happen? How did I let that happen?
Yeah. You do a really, I mean, most of your book is your own experience, and you go into the scientific details behind, the history of the drugs, but you do touch on that you do make that comparison at times, comparing it to like, a religion, and like it's a great metaphor, because, and you mentioned, just the authority figure of that doctor with the lab coat. It's like a priest with the robe, and that swallowing the pill is like, a sacrament of, drinking the wine, the body and blood of Christ and all. And then confession, the act of confession. There's so many parallels.
Yep. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, and I don't have the numbers in mind, but I know over the past 70 years, the numbers of people who identify with a religious faith have dropped significantly. I don't think it's a coincidence that the numbers of people who, are part of the mental health industry have skyrocketed.
Gosh. And yeah, and it's still, I do hope we're at a turning point. Because you did have some positive reviews. You did get some pieces published, even in the same outlets that are criticizing you. But just to put put things in perspective. So that Irving Kirsch, that 60-minute segment that I played earlier, which exposed that these antidepressants are really no better than a placebo in most cases, and very harmful. There were 17 million Americans on antidepressants at that time. Now it's at least double that. So,
Yeah.
I mean, just think about how does that happen? How does the problem continue to get, exponentially worse or spread exponentially, even when there's such damning information like that from someone who's not from an expert, from somebody that even the people that are in the whole industry would acknowledge is an expert. It's
a really good question. And I think we all have to reflect on it together as a society, because, I think there are a lot of layers to the answer, but I do think a core reason is that we all want a quick fix, and not necessarily we here in this live stream together, but culturally, the kind of the potent consumerist culture that we live in, that is just bombarding us constantly with messaging around, if you feel any kind of discomfort in mind, body, and spirit, there's something wrong with you that you need to take action to rectify, or just, come try this thing. It's going to help you feel better, feel happier, feel more productive, feel this, feel that, until such time comes as we all collectively pause that impulse and actually together reflect on what have we lost here in this quest for the quick fix, and including what do we not even realize we've lost? Because that's one of the insidious things about growing up psychiatrized. Being put on these drugs as a kid meant that I had no idea what I was missing as an adult in the world, because I had literally never had the experience of being an unmedicated adult. And so I think it's a really important question, and it's an urgent question, because in all ways, in all facets of day-to-day life, we are struggling with physical, with chronic disease, with despair, with suicide rates, with, anxiety, all of the, clearly the quick fix isn't working for people. And yet we're still pursuing it. And so what is it going to take for us to just at least just pause for a minute? And that doesn't mean no one should ever seek relief. Of course, there's only so much pain that you can bear as a human before you need relief. But does it, what percentage of what we are currently seeking quick fixes for, are only being, it's only actually worsening, how much of our suffering is actually being worsened by the pursuit of getting rid of it, of eradicating it.
Do you have any insight as to why it seems to be mostly women and white women that are in this, the therapy industry and on the antidepressants?
I should have better numbers in mind about, with race differences. I mean, I do know that the psychiatrization of there's certain categories where like Black men, for example, are much more likely to be given a schizophrenia diagnosis, and of course foster kids are super drugged up. So I don't know the numbers race wise. I should have them in mind. But in terms of women, yes, and women are on the whole taking more psychiatric drugs, getting more electroshock. It's part of why I picked the cover of my book. I think it's really hard to be a girl and a young woman. It's hard to be anyone in any category. But I do think, speaking for myself, my true nature is someone who I feel deeply, I feel intensely. I am a very sensitive person. Like I can absorb energies around me easily. I grew up in a kind of socio-economic and like kind of cultural climate where there was a lot of pressure on us as girls to excel and how we looked and how we acted. And, you know, it was inevitable that I was going to have a breakdown because, you know, that's not a good recipe for thriving when you are a big feeler and sensitive in nature, and yet the world around you is completely ill-equipped for that. And so this isn't me saying that, you know, it isn't really hard to also be a boy and a young man. It is also in all kinds of ways. So don't get me wrong there. But I think that our true nature as girls and women is one that our culture isn't necessarily kind of like set up to nurture and cultivate and harness effectively. I think a lot of us end up repressing things that we feel, compartmentalizing parts of ourselves that don't feel good enough or whatever. And we also end up really like, one thing I realized the more I healed from being on psych drugs and also being on oral contraception for 16 years, which I didn't have a chance to go too much into in my book because there just wasn't space for it. But that is a massive story that is just as shocking as the psych drug story, just how we as girls and women have been completely hoodwinked into thinking that taking the pill is our path to liberation and power and independence. It's quite the opposite. But when I healed from all of that pharmaceutical trauma, the more I healed, the more I realized how disembodied I had been through my teenage years, through my 20s, how I just never had the opportunity to like really be in myself fully. And of course, that's going to lead you to lose your shit eventually. So I think it's like, I'm sure it's way more complicated than that. But when I think about it in my own life, and a lot of the women I know and the girls I know who get psychiatrized, we're super perceptive of things going awry around us, but don't have the space to articulate that. We feel big feelings. We don't have the space to feel them. We sense things deeply. We don't have the space or the kind of support to take that and like turn it into something that can be useful. We just keep it in. And yeah, like I love my cover so much because it was my fucking anger that helped me find my way out. And I realized it was my anger also back in the beginning that got me psychiatrized in the first place. And I had to feel my anger to free myself. And that like today, I treasure my anger. It's in and of itself. It's like I think it's a beautiful emotion. It just depends on what you do with it that can turn it into something destructive or toxic. For me, it's been like my fuel for my work is my anger. And I'm like, I want all the girls and women out there who feel smothered, compartmentalized, suppressed to just like break out and be fucking angry. They're going to label you borderline, just like critics have been labeling me borderline for weeks now, since reviews have been coming out about my book, which I love. I'm sorry, I just love it. I think it's so it just proves my point.
Yeah, it is validating. But I would say like, so yeah, feel the anger, use it and take accountability of it, like recognize it instead of like, oh, that's not me. That's just my mental disorder.
Yeah. This theme of responsibility, which you've been bringing up, which is so important. Feeling big feelings doesn't mean that you should let your emotions drive everything you say and do in the world. And that like your feelings are the most important things. It's all that matters. And if you're outraged, tear that person down. Or if you, you for sure, leaving one's psychiatrization behind definitely means stepping back into the driver's seat and like taking responsibility for what we say, what we do, learning how to feel emotions, but also have the discretion to know when they demand action or when they just demand to be listened to and felt, and then moved on from. It's not, and that's a threatening message for a lot of people, once myself included. I would have been so offended at the thought of like taking responsibility for myself. Like, how dare you? Like, do you not know how sick I am? So I get when people are mad about this.
You've used the word psychiatrized a lot. I had never heard it before listening to you. You want to explain that, and if it has a history?
Yeah, well, I should verify this. I'm pretty sure that the term was coined in the 60s by Leonard Roy Frank, who I had the honor of meeting and spending some time with before he died, like a decade or so ago. This at the time back then, obviously there's like anti-war, civil rights, women's rights. There was this like very politicized cultural climate that recognized class and corporate power and the power of the military industrial complex. Like there was just an awareness back then that, I think in many ways, like we've lacked for a while, but it was in that climate that a group of current and former self-identified mental patients kind of came together and organized themselves and began this movement that eventually was called the Mental Patients Liberation Movement. And it was in that time that I think the word psychiatrization, was coined. And this was back, it was really about human rights and about the fact that when you are labeled crazy, you can be stripped of your basic civil liberties, and that psychiatrists have the power to incarcerate you against your will with no due process, to violate your body with injections of drugs that you don't want, to forcibly electroshock you, to restrain you, to strip you of custody of your children, to, there's this tremendous power that a mental health professional has. And so a lot of the original movement was about resisting that power and helping people actually like take back their right to choose. And so that word psychiatrize, when I came off drugs back in 2010, I didn't see it anywhere. I just, I can't remember if it kind of like arose in me organically or if I had maybe read something that Leonard had written, but I just remember when it first came to mind, I was like, this is the word. This is the word. If you're going to reduce the whole experience to one word, it is this. It's just like turning yourself into a psychiatric patient or being turned into a psychiatric patient. And I love the flip side of it, de-psychiatrize, which we're trying to use more and more and kind of like really get into the zeitgeist, psychiatrize and de-psychiatrize. For those of us who want to leave that behind, I think it's a great word to anyone listening or watching. Like, please spread it.
Interesting. Yeah. And that whole thing about, being how the state can, and professionals are legally obligated to put you in an asylum if you just say you've had suicidal thoughts. Is that?
Or you might in the future.
Yeah. See, that's crazy. Okay. And now this might be controversial, but okay. I think that anybody with like an ounce of creativity has had like what could be considered a suicidal thought. Ooh. How can you just think, just talking about it right now, everybody just listening to us say the word suicidal thought, you're having a thought about suicide and you could be thrown in an asylum for that. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Technically. Yeah.
Certain, I mean, it's psychiatrists, it's psychologists. I think in some states, even social workers have this power to, pink slip you is what it's called at least in like the Northeast, where yes, if a clinician determines that you are or could become a risk to yourself or someone else, it's their they're legally mandated to take action to prevent you from that possibility of violence to self or others. It's more power. I mean, you can make a very strong case that a psychiatrist has more power than any other person in our society, more than police, more than judges, more than, because there's,
they can imprison you for a thought crime.
Literally.
Literally.
And, they'll say, oh, well, there's a limit, it's 3 days. So there's something called a 3-day hold. So if let's say you, or for like, I'm having a really hard time, like, I don't know if I can do it much longer, like whatever. And someone calls the cops on you or calls a crisis line, and you happen to then say that again in that interrogation, they would have the right then and there to admit you against your will to the hospital. You might end up boarding in an emergency room. That often happens to people. So you would be in a room, there'd be a security guard watching you, and they have the right to keep you there for 3 days with no due process whatsoever. And then at the end of 3 days, they can either release you if they've decided you're not a threat anymore, or if they think you are, but you don't want to admit yourself, then there would be a hearing. But I've sat in on many of these hearings, supporting friends, like advocating for people. It's a total kangaroo court. Like, I have a memory. I remember sitting in a private psychiatric hospital in Massachusetts. They were trying to not only forcibly, my friend was committed. She was already involuntarily a patient. They wanted to forcibly drug her and forcibly electroshock her, which still happens. This is like a fancy private psychiatric hospital. And I remember being in the courtroom, which was the day room on the unit, and they put up like giant white sticky paper to cover the windows. So there was the judge, there was the staff, the hospital, like the head psychiatrist of the unit, my friend and her public defender, who literally like showed up 2 minutes before, had never met her before, clearly didn't give a shit about her rights. And I remember I was there. She asked me to be there as her advocate. And I remember watching the judge look to the hospital psychiatrist and say, I'm not a doctor. Doc, like, what do you think? And I was like, wait, what? And I ended up, it's a long story, but I realized this public defender doesn't care. This judge is completely deferential to this doctor. And like, how often is this happening to people? And I think it happens a lot more than we realize. But because when you're a crazy person, kind of hidden away in a psychiatric institution, no one sees you. You're invisible. You're made invisible. And that's one thing I keep in mind as much as I possibly can when I'm speaking. Like, I recognize the privilege that I have a voice that I get to use, that I was born into a family who had the financial means to take care of me when I couldn't take care of myself, including when I was trying to get off these drugs and heal. I'm aware of how many people, poor people, people who have no resources, who will never be heard because they are disappeared into state institutions. It's a massive, massive enterprise that people don't even realize. I think a lot of people think a psych hospital is like the spa. Like, you just go get a rest, go have a rest, just go check in for a few days. Like, what the fuck do you think happens on a locked ward, people?
Yeah.
Not
yeah. And I mean, you talked about your own experience. You've been inside the mental hospital and even forced to be there, as you've described. You've seen it happen to other people. Correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't you have that kind of vision too at first? You're like, oh, it's like a spa, or yeah.
My first hospital, I was so disappointed when I was discharged from my first hospitalization. Like, you didn't even. It's just like you warehoused me for a week, and I ate like really, like I basically just drank decaf coffee and watched SpongeBob SquarePants, which for some reason was always on TV there. I just sat there.
And they charged you thousands of dollars for that, probably.
Probably. I mean, my insurance, I'm sure that my insurance companies made a lot of, I'm sure however they were set up, they made a lot of money off of me. But yeah. There's a lot of money to make on psych patients. My husband, I wish I had the exact number in mind, but he at one point calculated when he was working in Connecticut for kind of an advocacy organization, he dug up a shocking number. I think to house one person for 1 year on a unit in a hospital, in the public hospital in Connecticut, it's like $680,000. It's like you could buy them a fucking house and get them like a car.
Wow.
They can go to Whole Foods, buy organic stuff whenever they want. I mean, the amount of money that gets made off of chronic psych patients.
Yeah, I mean, you could watch SpongeBob for the rest of your life
Totally.
from your own damn house. Like, jeez. Wow.
Yeah. And this is, again, we're like barely scratching the surface of how big this thing is. Like, there's so many, like, think about the role that this plays in family courts, in the criminal justice system, or whatever you want to call it, where psychiatrists have the power to decide whether you're guilty of a crime or not. Talk about like not being held responsible for your actions. Like, it's massive, the power that we as a society have imbued mental health professionals with. And we really do have to like talk about that more.
Yeah. So you mentioned your first experience with a mental hospital was, underwhelming to say the least, but that story is pretty mild compared to what does happen. Can you go into the more serious, dark experiences you've had?
Just that I had myself, or that I've seen or heard?
Both.
Yeah.
And because I think also just to help people understand, like, you really went through it. Like, some people listening might just dismiss you. What does she know? She was, so she was on antidepressants for a few weeks. Like, what the hell does she know? You have a little more experience with that. Can you go into it?
Yeah, well, and I should say, compared to what many people I know have experienced, I'm a walk in the park, and my experience was fucking brutal. So it's,
I would not describe your story as a walk in the park.
Well,
no way.
How
many years? 19 prescription drugs. How many years of this? And that
years. No, it was really hard. It was really dark, for sure. But I have friends who've been in state institutions for years at a time, like one stretch, 2 years. They're just disappeared from life. And what even happens to them there, like, I don't even know. But injection, people being injected against their will with antipsychotics, like, so yeah, I mean, for me, so it was a 14-year career as a psych patient. And in that time I had 4 inpatient hospitalizations, and then like countless, programs and day treatment, outpatient, all that stuff. Funnily enough, like, I loved at the time, I loved being inpatient. I was not, until the last experience was what kind of disrupted all of that. But I was never restrained. I have friends who've been pinned down by police, security guards, doctors, put in 4-point restraints, which, for anyone not familiar, is literally when both of your wrists and both of your ankles are attached, like you're put on your stomach on a bed or on the floor, and like you're literally put in chains, basically, and you can't move. I have friends who've been left in 4-point restraints in an isolation room for like a day, like a full day. Like, they had to piss themselves because no one came. Like, it's really horrible things happen to people. They're injected, pants are pulled down, a syringe is injected in their ass to sedate them. This happens all the time to people. That never happened to me. I was always a compliant patient. So it wasn't until the very end that I'd seen those kinds of things when I was inpatient. Like, I watched people get restrained. I watched people get taken away. But I just was like, I couldn't even fathom that ever happening to me because I was so devoted to being a good, compliant little psych patient. And at the very end, in my last hospitalization, I had actually like wanted to go inpatient, but to summarize the story briefly, I go into it in the book. My psychopharmacologist like caught wind that I wanted to kill myself. And so it said like, why don't you just go over to the short-term unit and, get taken care of, blah, blah, blah. I was like, yeah, that's a really good idea. I just need to go home and get my belongings first, and then I'll come back, which I meant. I really was going to come back. I was not going to go kill myself. And he was like, oh, I can't let you do that. And I was like, what do you mean? I was like, I have to get my like sweatpants and my books and my toothbrush. He's like, I can't let you leave. You need to go right now. And so things escalated, and I started to get angry and raise my voice, and he called security, and these like big burly security guards escorted me over to the locked ward and like gave me the choice to go in voluntarily or against my will. And so I chose voluntary. So on paper, I've never been involuntarily committed, but thank God for that beautiful experience, however crazy that sounds to say, because that is what woke me up. That was like the first dislodging of my faith in that whole industry, was realizing like, wow, I've just been assuming this whole system is designed to take care of me. And like, it's actually about control. I just never saw this before because I've never said no. It was a profound shift in me from there on in. And it almost became like inevitable at that point that I would start to question everything else, because it was like such a shock to realize like, how have I not seen this before? Even though I'd seen it like happen to other people, I hadn't really absorbed what that meant, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And they put you on some pretty serious drugs in those institutions. Lithium being one of them. Would that be the most severe? Or
the antipsychotics too. Well, I would say lithium caused the most damage to my body. That what I personally, like subjectively, from my own perspective of all the drugs I was on, and I was only on it for 2 years. Like other drugs I was on for almost a decade. I'd say lithium and then the various antipsychotics that I was on.
What were those called? Yeah.
Oh God, I mean,
I'm trying to remember. There were so many I couldn't remember.
Risperdal, Abilify. Like they would throw me on like Zyprexa at one point, but I didn't stay on it very long. Not Luvox. What's the other one? I can't even remember there was one like a long time ago. But Abilify was
how crazy that you've already said like 4 or 5, and there's still more. Like this, what the hell? Like, wow.
There's a lot of I imagine anyone watching who's like been on psych drugs would probably nod. There's a lot of just like switching and like, let's try this and like this, let's add this one in and cut that one. And what's so wild, Orf, is that I remember feeling like so special, being like, wow, they're like really thinking carefully. They're going to like try a little of this and try, like, I thought this was a sign of how good they were at what they were doing. Now I look back, I'm like, they had no fucking idea what they were doing.
Exactly. Yeah. Like you're like a guinea pig. It's not that, they're trying everything because you're basically a guinea pig.
Yeah. And I just kept getting worse and worse. And so God bless them. I mean, honestly, like, I don't blame any of those doctors for the decisions they made for me, because they had these like, these blinders on from the moment they entered medical school on. They were just kind of trained to see whatever human being is in front of them as this like list of symptoms to kind of intervene upon with pills. And, I feel for them, that's a really hard place to be in. And I get how with each passing year, you just become more like jaded about the whole thing when you're just watching people be chronic and like not find their way to thriving, and but you can't actually face in yourself, like, could it be because I'm giving them these potent drugs that are like disabling them? Like, you can't, it's too much to face that. Your whole life is built on these drugs helping people. So like I really have a lot of compassion for my doctors, for all the prescribers out there who are in this mess. They're doing the best they can with what they have, and what they have is super limited.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I was kind of, I mean, you are super understanding and forgiving and sympathetic to those who did harm you, because, you know, as you say, it was unintentional. And that's why it was so, you know, it's just so messed up how the Washington Post calls you anti-expert when you really went out of your way to express understanding and offer sympathy, you know, and humanize those people whose diagnoses, treatments, and prescriptions harmed you.
Yeah, well, and I think that accusation of being anti-expert, I can't help but wonder if that is the reviewer's way of interpreting the kind of like one of the core messages that I try to carry in my work, which is that expertise like doesn't always come from the institution. In the case of getting off these drugs, there's just no denying the fact that it's those of us who've done it ourselves and who've had to figure out how to taper who are the experts here. Like, it's just currently in the United States, as of March 2025, we have more knowledge than any prescriber. Those of us who have spent years and years and years, like, deeply immersed in the kind of technical side of tapering, helping people through it, providing support. And I think that is what, to hear like lay people, ordinary people claiming expertise over something like that, I think is my sense of her calling me an anti-expert, is in part just not being able to process what that means, that those of us, just regular ordinary people, actually have the ability to find our way to expertise through experiencing things ourselves. Which the word, I love to say, the word expertise comes from the Latin word experitus, which means tried, proved, known through experience. So literally this word comes from this idea. But it's what a threat that idea is to the experts, capital T, capital E.
Yeah. Yeah. Although I and some of the viewers would say, you know, it is okay to, you know, have some anger for the doctors. Even now, I'll read a comment from Sparky. He says, "No, blame the doctors. They're supposed to be smart, but they believe pharmaceutical salesmen with no medical background."
I'm with you in that anger. Do not get me wrong. I think for me, it's like a coexistence of anger and compassion at the same time. But I'm like right there with everyone in the anger. I mean, like this cover says everything. Like my anger is endless for sure, but it's not the only emotion I feel about it all.
Interesting. I thought the cover, can we see that cover again? I actually, when I saw it, she looked like, I thought she was kind of like more like, yeah, I guess she does look pretty angry, but I also saw it as kind of like a neutral, like numbed state.
Oh, I love that. That's how you see it. I mean, that's exciting to me, that it's totally a matter of interpretation. I think probably because I'm putting my own debutante experience, like she's in this white wedding dress, and so I feel anger when I see her painting because it evokes like my own personal history. But I love that it evokes that in you, because that also is relevant. Numbed, like just apathetic.
That happens on the medications. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Can you talk about just to go with a theme that we did touch on, how psychiatry has kind of become a new religion. There's this incredible headline from 2015, really not too long ago. It says, I don't believe in God. This is New York Times Magazine. No, New York Times Magazine. I don't believe in God, but I believe in lithium. Now, I would like you to share your experience with lithium.
Oh, it was one of the most fun and fresh and angering chapters to write in my book. I have a chapter called Lithium. Yeah, I mean, it is a drug that has a very powerful mythology around it in mental health culture. Whenever that drug was mentioned during my time as a patient, it was as this gold standard, the tried and true, most reliable, effective treatment for bipolar. It's been around forever. It's really well tested. I just remember it having this power as this like miracle drug. And so when I went on a deep dive into understanding and to like learning the history of lithium as I was writing this book, and realized that it's I mean, it's the truth of this drug is far different than that mythology, we patients are given about it. Yeah, it was a powerful realization, because it is a drug that is almost like it lives on a pedestal in the psychiatric profession as this like really special thing. And so I remember when I like I said earlier, I was only on it for 2 years out of all the drugs I was on.
God.
Yeah, it's all relative. And in that time, it managed to destroy my thyroid function, give me an autoimmune thyroid condition, severely damage my like digestive kind of like stomach, all the issues that came with that.
Like it's a chemical imbalance in the stomach, an actual chemical imbalance.
Yeah, I don't even
that term is so
yeah. It and then of course like the issue, it's really it can cause a lot of damage to the kidneys and liver. So which is part of why you have to get blood tests regularly, which funnily enough, like I often never got, which is really wild because it is such a poisonous substance. And until the mid 20th century, it was banned as a neurotoxin and as like it had caused all these cardiovascular issues. Like it was a known toxin.
Poison. Yeah. It was known poison.
Yeah. And the story, I go into the story of like how it eventually became approved and on what evidence base it became approved, which is like shocking when you actually see how shoddy the evidence base is that the drug was eventually approved on. But that article, I mention Ms. Lowe's article in my book, and in one of the reviews that the reviewer points that out too. And like, I think I feel a lot of compassion for her. Obviously, I don't know her. I only read this article, and the sense I took from this article is that her faith in lithium has really been solidified, because every time she tries to come off of it, shit hits the fan. And so the question I ask, and I truly ask it with curiosity, I don't pretend to know anything about her, because how could I? I've never met her before. I would never be so presumptuous. But knowing so many people in my life who are on lithium right now, I know many people who feel they need it because every time they try to come off it, they feel horrible. I can't help but wonder if you tried tapering more slowly, or tapering at all instead of just stopping it, like could it look different? And I think that that faith that so many people have in their drugs because of how horrible they feel when they stop them is a really insidious like powerful kind of like reinforcing mechanism that keeps a lot of people on these drugs long term. Again, to go back to the whole like dependence and withdrawal thing, just they don't realize how much they've been altered by these drugs and how slow they need to take, which I'm realizing I don't think I actually have said yet. What we have found in the layperson withdrawal community, and this is over like decades of people experimenting on themselves, basically, is that a taper rate of between 5 and 10% per month. And you calculate that cut based on whatever your previous month's dose was, so that it's not, so just to make an example, if you're on 100 milligrams of a drug and you're going to cut it 10% a month, you would cut 10 milligrams in month 1, 10% of 100. So now you're on 90. In month 2, you would cut 10% of 90. So you remove 9 milligrams. So now you're on 81. Month 3, you would cut 10% of 81, which is 8.1 milligrams. So the amount you're reducing is getting progressively smaller over time, which means for some people it takes years to get off of these drugs, because if they go any faster, their whole central nervous system goes haywire and they just like can't function, which is a hard pill to swallow, no pun intended, when you realize like, holy shit, if I've been on these drugs for 15 years, I might need like a lot of time to get off. But what we say is that the fastest way to get off and stay off is to go really slowly. Because if you go off too fast and all hell breaks loose, a lot of people end up back on the drugs, on more of them, on new drugs, hospitalized for weeks. Everything's set back. So yeah, it's a really messy territory, this tapering thing for a lot of people.
And go back to these terrible, attacks on you. They say, they like dismiss you, like, Laura Delano with no, medical experience, is doing this. But the people with experience, they know nothing about this. They know nothing about tapering. Most of them, at least certainly when you were going through it, you literally describe like, just in order to get a lower prescription. I recall in your book, you're literally teaching your therapist so that they can give you the right, or the psychiatrist to give you the right prescription. I recall.
Yeah, people often, when people reach out to me for help, often it's literally to help them educate their doctors about tapering, if the doctor's even open to hear it. Yeah. Like psychiatrists reach out to me all the time for help. It's really wonderful. It's and that of course didn't make it through into any of the recent coverage.
Yeah.
I hear, and our nonprofit hears from mental health professionals all the time who are basically like, thank you so much for all of your resources. We send our patients to you all the time. And also, like, can you help train me and my colleagues in tapering? Because like, we have no idea what we're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, I've trained psychiatrists all over in Europe, in Brazil, across the US. There are some really wonderful, humble, open-minded practitioners who recognize the limits of their knowledge and who recognize this whole like guinea pig nature of what they're doing here with their patients. And they recognize this expertise that we lay people have. But of course, there are just as many, if not more, who just can't find their way to that openness to hear what we're saying and to see we actually want to partner with them. Like, I love the idea of educating mental health professionals. I would love it if we didn't need to exist because every prescriber was so well trained in safe tapering.
Yeah.
I don't see that day coming anytime soon, but I'd love it.
Yeah, and one of those experts, I think a psychiatrist, is Mark something or other. He
Mark Horowitz.
Yeah, and you interviewed through your nonprofit channel and all.
Mm-hmm.
That story was pretty amazing too. His story.
He's an important. I'm so glad he's in the world doing what he's doing. And as he himself says, like, had he not gone through this himself as a patient on these drugs that he's had a really hard time tapering off of, he never would have believed that this is real. So I think the fact that he has both taken and tried to come off these drugs himself and is a psychiatrist lends him a really important voice. And it's great to see changes happening, certainly over in England, in the UK. They're implementing tapering guidelines based on what we lay people have figured out. Things are changing in Australia. We're just way behind the game.
Didn't he do some big study, or he didn't? Yeah, Mark Horowitz.
He's done some discontinuation studies with Joanna Moncrief, if I'm remembering correctly. But
or analysis of other studies, rather, if I'm
he may well have, but the big contribution he's made in the past year or two is the Maudsley deprescribing guidelines, which he co-authored with David Taylor, which are these official kind of government sanctioned tapering guidelines that are now recognized officially over there as how people should be tapered off of these drugs. And we have nothing like that here. And interestingly, that New York Times article apparently asked the American Psychiatric Association about this, and they said, oh, we'll have deprescribing guidelines out within the year. But I've asked every single psychiatrist I know who understands safe tapering, and that's not many, just like a handful. I'm like, did you hear from the APA? Are they asking you to advise them on this? And they're like, no. So I don't know who they're talking to about deprescribing, but it's definitely not any of the deprescribing psychiatrists I'm aware of.
And the APA, that's the American Psychiatric Association.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, jeez. Which, and just recently, the head of that was talking about how they're just spreading false information that depression is the result of a chemical imbalance, or that the drugs help you by addressing this chemical imbalance, which has been totally debunked. I wish I had that video queued up.
Yeah. But... Yeah. Oh yeah. That woman, that's a good clip. Yeah. And it really cracks me up every time I hear psychiatrists online claiming, we've always known there was no such thing as a chemical imbalance. We never tell our patients that. I'm like, tell that to the 85% of Americans who, when surveyed, say that they, think this is a cause. And to all the, drug ads, and it's just infused our culture, this idea of a chemical imbalance. It's laughable to think that this is being overblown. Oh, we never really said that to people. I find it quite amusing, to be honest.
And I might just kind of end with the beginning, and at least of your transformation now at this point, and it began with this book by Robert Whitaker. And what's amazing is, some of the reviews, actually, I think both the ones I read, Washington Post and New York Times, at least the New York Times one, they referred to this book, which is an important part of your story and waking up, and really misled the readers about it.
Yeah.
You want to tell this story of how did this book change your trajectory?
Yeah. And this, that critique,
Anatomy of an Epidemic, I should say the name of the book.
Exactly. Yeah. By Robert Whitaker. And Bob and this book it's par for the course to try to discredit this book, which has won awards and, is a rigorously researched book. So yeah, basically, so this book came out in 2010, which was the same year that I woke up, so to speak. And when I found it in a bookshelf, I was on 5 drugs. I was on lithium, Lamictal, Abilify, Effexor, and Ativan. And I remember seeing this cover. The hardcover version is a red background, and then the head is all white. So it's a really bold Yeah, I have it in my bookshelf over there. It's a bold, it hits you hard when you're looking at it from, 5 feet away. And I remember seeing this cover and thinking to myself, like, whoa, I've been on a lot of these drugs in these little compartments in this phrenology head. Like, what is this book? Like, I think I'm going to get it. And I was so heavily medicated that reading was really hard. I barely could absorb words. I didn't even really know what the book was about. I just went back and started reading it. And the question that he explored in his research that led to the writing of this book was like, why are long-term outcomes, like he was particularly interested in them for schizophrenia, for that diagnosis. Why are they better in countries that don't have, thriving psychiatric drug industries? Because he'd been previously kind of assuming that, like so many people assume, psychiatric medications are these really incredible treatments and they help people recover and blah, blah, blah. But what he realized through researching this book was that if you actually look at what the data is telling us, on the whole, long-term use of psychiatric drugs is making us sicker, more disabled. So disability rates due to so-called mental illness was a big fact, like one of the data points that he looked at. So when I started reading this book, and he posed this question in the book, basically like, what if the treatment is actually disabling us? It was this aha moment, and it all just kind of flooded in, like the year after year after year of me being on these drugs, my life falling more and more apart, my parents and I being told I'm just getting sicker and sicker until I'm treatment resistant. And I just realized, like, what if it's the fucking treatment? Like, holy shit. And it had never occurred to me. Never had I ever considered this before. You could call that crazy in and of itself, but it was just what was true for me. So that book gave me, of all the things it gave me, it gave me a new sense of possibility for my future, because I had believed for so many years that it was basically just like miserable treatment resistant mental illness, like being on psych hospitals and trying not to kill myself and taking tons of drugs and living with my family and not being able to function, or suicide. And now suddenly I'm like, wait a minute, if my life didn't have to have maybe it didn't have to have gone the way that it went, if I just hadn't started these drugs, like what could happen for me if I actually come off of these drugs? So that was the beginning of this beautiful, painful, terrifying, miraculous journey I've been on ever since, that I'm still very much on. Like, life is fucking hard, man. It's like really hard to be alive. But I've realized it's not about the absence of emotional pain. Like, I don't need that anymore. I don't need to be happy all the time and balanced and have my shit together. Like, you're not meant to. That's a fucking
exactly.
trick.
Exactly. It's not normal to be happy all the goddamn time. And that's why this was such a these antidepressants are such a gold mine for the prescription drug companies, because literally everybody's a potential customer, because nobody is happy all the time. It is not normal. It's never happened in the history of the world. But you see those commercials of the Zoloft ball, and you're just like, oh, I felt sad. Something's wrong with me inside. I felt sad for more than 3 or 4 days in a row. I know I'm bipolar or whatever else. Yep. That's another thing. So you were diagnosed as bipolar, but when you went to find the notes of your psychiatrists, you found they weren't even sure themselves of that diagnosis that they diagnosed you with. And yet they kept prescribing these. Tell us about that. That was a wild find. And how was that, discovering that? That's incredible.
Yeah, it was the psychiatrist I saw when I was 18. which was the year that I kind of voluntarily went back to psychiatry. So back when I was first sent there as a 14-year-old, I resisted it. And I was like, fuck this. There's nothing wrong with me. I just tried to avoid it. But eventually I gave in. I was just like in so much pain and I just couldn't go on anymore. And so I took myself back. And it was that psychiatrist who I saw my freshman year in college. Like I remember leaving the first appointment thinking, yep, I am bipolar. I was all along. That first psychiatrist had been right. So what he said enough to me to lead me to conclude I was bipolar. But yes, when I got my notes from him years later, he had said basically like rule out bipolar disorder, personality, like borderline personality traits more likely or something. So he himself did not officially give me the diagnosis. That being said, I did get it definitively, like in the, later months, like, and then had it definitively through the rest of my career. I did also get the borderline label and then a whole slew of other labels along the way, like social anxiety disorder and substance use disorder. Because eventually getting myself trashed every night was like the best tool I had to not kill myself. So like drinking became a problem for a while when I was on 3 to 5 psych drugs. Of course it will be. But yeah, the record, going back and looking through my records was really enlightening in many ways. And it's something that if anyone out there is like thinking about doing that for yourself, which you totally should, I found for me, I needed to have enough distance from the experience to come to them as a journalist and an investigator more than as like a person whose records these were, because you are going to see things that are not nice to see. If you can even get your records at all, which is not easy to do, even though it's your right. So yeah.
Yeah, and you worked really. This is not only is it a personal story, but yes, that's so true. It is a work of investigative journalism, and it took a lot of effort for you to find that get the records from that one psychiatrist or therapist. And I know you saw many, and you refer to many of them, the actual notes of these psychiatrists and therapists. And that last one, that was a pretty epic story, epic scene, I'll say. Yeah. When you finally just finally come face to face with that woman. Is she the one that originally diagnosed you, or
no?
Or the second one to prescribe? First one to prescribe?
No, but she was the one I saw when I tried to kill myself. She was was my doctor when I overdosed. So we had and she's the psychiatrist I had the longest relationship with. I saw her for like 7 years, something like that, 6-7 years.
And yeah.
So, and she, I care deeply about her to this day. Whether she knows that or not, I can't say. And my gosh, I hope obviously I changed all the names of all the doctors in my book, with the exception of one whose name I had to use because I also cite his research, John Gunderson. But I have no doubt that she will recognize herself if she reads this book, which I hope she does, because I care deeply about her and I really don't blame her for anything, because I know that she truly wanted to help me. She just didn't have, she was just indoctrinated into her own, box, just as I was in my own box. But getting
it was the same box. You just had different roles. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. It was hard to get my records from her. I think because she was just so terrified. She knew I had been writing a blog for many years. I started a blog in 2010. Originally, it was called Journeying Back to Self. And then I started a whole website called Recovering from Psychiatry that I've since taken offline. But she found that writing, and so was, of course, scared of why I wanted my records. Am I going to sue her? Am I going to accuse her of something? Am I going to out her? And I had to make clear multiple times, like, I have no ill will towards you. I'm just trying to make sense of like what the fuck happened back there. Just like, and I need my records to try to do that. And I also symbolically need them because it's my life. It's not your property. Like, even though legally therapist notes are their property, which is wild. Yeah, she never actually gave me my complete record. She just like gave me a little summary, but
wow,
I don't need them anymore. That's the beauty of it.
Thanks so much for sharing this story, and just another example of how threatening this is to kind of like a mainstream thinking, or at least what has been mainstream thinking for the last several decades. We mentioned how they not only try to discredit you and your story, but in your book, but also the book that inspired you. Obviously, hopefully, your book continues, the whole process and reaches more people, right? That's the whole idea. I think there's really has strong potential to do that. Probably already is doing that. And I want to just refer to the New York Times review one more time, and it's specifically one way that they attacked that Anatomy of an Epidemic book. And here, I'll read from it. Now, I'm reading from the book's author, Robert Whitaker, but here's the quote from the New York Times that he dismantles. So the New York Times says, at 27, she picked up a book by the journalist Robert Whitaker, Anatomy of an Epidemic, Magic Bullets, Psychiatric Drugs, and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness in America. In the book, Mr. Whitaker proposed that the increasing use of psychotropic medications was to blame for the rise in psychiatric disorders. In scientific journals, reviewers dismissed Mr. Whitaker's analysis as polemical, cherry-picking data to support a broad, oversimplified argument. Now, let's rewind a little bit, everybody. She said in scientific journals it was dismissed. Mr. Whitaker's ideas were dismissed in scientific journals. But how misleading is that? That is extremely misleading, because what was in the scientific journal sites wasn't science. It was literally book reviews. So, but by saying the scientific journals had debunked Whitaker is completely misleading. And Whitaker does a good job of breaking this down. And also, I don't believe he even made that such a bold statement that increasing use of psychotropic medications was to blame for the rise in psychiatric disorders. He certainly posed the question, like, why are we having an increase in people with psychiatric disorders if, since this medicine was introduced? If you would think it would be the opposite, right? If this medicine was effective, we'd have less people with mental disorders. So anyway, any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm glad Bob wrote his piece here, and it's worth reading for sure, because he really systematically kind of goes through each of the factual errors in the New York Times article. And yeah, I say it to him. I think about it myself. The fact that there's so much anger is a sign that we're hitting a nerve in an important way. And so I welcome it. I mean, of course, it's always wonderful to have the support of people who, kind of see things in the way that I'm seeing them, resonate with the way that I'm seeing things. But I've been ready. I've been working on this book for 5 years, and was in that process, like readying myself for the anger because I knew it would come, and I'm sure it's only just beginning. But it's a sign of that we're those of us doing this work, because I'm so far from the only one who's sharing a story like this, who's working in this area to kind of shine a light on where the mental health industry has maybe led our society astray. I have many people who walk the path before me, mentors, people I look up to and have learned from. And I think we just have to keep speaking our voices and coming together and getting these ideas out into the world, especially through storytelling. Because I know for me, Bob's book has, really compelling data in it, but it was the stories of the people he wrote about in the book that really hooked me, because I saw myself in them. And it was that kind of power of identification that opened me up to actually hear these ideas that were very terrifying to face. It is terrifying to face the prospect that all these years of your life maybe didn't have to go the way they've gone. And that this system you've been turning to for help has been harming you. It's a really scary thing. And I do think that having compassion and understanding for how scary that is for so many different people in these respective positions, both patients and family members, psychiatrists, therapists, we have to really show each other grace and compassion, including those people who are spewing vitriol at us, because they're afraid. This fear, I think. And yeah, fear doesn't help. Acting from a place of fear doesn't help anything. So how do we help people sink deeper than the fear and actually find their way to curiosity? More than anything, I think.
Yeah, your response to the attacks, Laura Delano, reminds me of a quote from another Delano, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He said to the critics, he said, "I welcome their hatred." And that's a great quote. And I
didn't
have
know
to say,
that. That's cool.
Yeah. So people in the comments, I welcome your hatred and support.
Totally.
And also, I just want to be clear. This story you wrote, it is really nightmarish. It really is. But it has a great ending. It's a hero's journey. And can you just explain where you are now? And I mean, were you just confirm, were you really able to get off all the medications, don't even need therapy, or don't even go to therapy? Not that, I don't know if you ever really needed it in the first place, right? But yeah, so what's your situation now?
Yeah, so today I'm almost 42. I am a mother and a stepmother. I have 2 boys. I'm a wife, and I have an ordinary and, blessed life that I never in my wildest imaginings could have imagined back in those dark years. And it definitely was a slow trudge through months and years to build a life for myself. And as I always say, was had access to a family that supported me when I needed it, which I don't know if I would have made it out alive if I didn't happen to have been born in a family that could provide for me. Class is a huge thing here, but that is not talked enough about. And yeah, I mean, people often assume I'm happy and everything's great. And I'm like, no, I have fucking wacky stuff in my head. But what human doesn't? What human isn't driven to some degree by insecurity and doubt and fear and grief and sadness and all of it? And I think even though a lot has changed for the better since I came off psych drugs and gave myself a chance to heal, in a very real, physiological way, heal. I'm still the same intense, sensitive, insecure me that I always was. Like the main difference is that I'm just not afraid of my mind anymore. That's the big shift, is that my darkness doesn't scare me. And so I choose not to seek professional help for what happens in the space between my ears, just because it doesn't feel right for me. But I have, I get support from my husband, from friends, from my work. I mean, my work, to have the opportunity to take what I went through and turn it into something that might help someone else, is my medicine, really. Sharing a story. And I say that to anyone here who's like has been through this or is in this similar situation. Like what you've been through means something really, really, really important. And can, if you feel called to it, can be an important gift for the world. None of it is in vain or lost or wasted. It's just so meaningful and valuable. So yeah, life is hard and wondrous. And I'm like still kind of sometimes like, wow, is this real? I get to just be a regular person. I don't have to be a chronic mental patient. Like sometimes still I'm like, wow, this is real. I'm really here, but it is.
Yeah, it's so clear, like in your book, and you express it so well, how significantly just that label of being a mental patient, or that label of being bipolar, totally changed the way you saw yourself and identity. And yeah, I mean, this story, it's a story of how you changed how you perceived yourself, right? How you were able to remove that label that had been put upon you and that you had originally, accepted so agreeably.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's the beautiful thing. We always have the power to change the stories we're telling ourselves about who we are and what our pain means. We are never sentenced to a story. We just have to decide to like seize the right and the power to actually tell ourselves a new one. And yeah, and that's really what becoming an ex-psych patient was about for me, at the heart of it all.
You mentioned, and congratulations, that you don't feel the need to do therapy anymore. You don't do therapy anymore, but you do have people in your life where you just reach out to and basically have a normal conversation that you would formerly would have to pay. Yeah, have to pay you, or didn't have to, but you would pay a professional to just voice your thoughts and have a back and forth with. And you could obviously, you could just do that with regular people. That's what we used to do before we psychiatrized society. God, what did I want to say about that? Damn. That's escaping me. I'm having a, maybe I need me. Maybe watch out there. I hope so. Exactly. ADHD or something.
But your point is such the power that we have just between us as ordinary people, and just how simple it is so much of the time. What we actually need, just being able to sit down at the dinner table and like pour out everything you're holding in to someone who isn't gonna, freak out or diagnose you or suggest you admit yourself, but just like be with you in it and listen and ask you what you need. And I mean, one of the challenges is that our society isn't well set up for those kinds of, who has time for that? Everyone's stressed, 9-to-5 jobs, caring for kids, living life. Like who can carve out 3 hours to like be with a friend in a crisis? But we fucking have to, if we're actually going to build spaces like adjacent to the mental health industry to help one another in more of a mutual aid kind of capacity. Like we have to change, you know, we have to find a way to make that time for one another, because without that, then people aren't going to have any other options besides going to pay someone for whatever service they're offering.
I remember what I wanted
Good.
to ask. So that whole, the whole experience of paying somebody else, right? It's a paying someone else to just have a conversation, or someone to talk to, just to talk to them. It's an example of commodification of just normal human experience. And I just think it's interesting that it seems to me that there's some overlap between, these educated women who also have these anti-capitalistic, anti-materialistic feelings or an ideology sometimes, like progressive types, and yet they don't see the contradiction in, this commodification of a normal human experience.
Yeah,
Point.
It's
what's going on there? Yeah,
I don't know, but I think it's a contradiction that is well worth continuing to point out and invite people to kind of grapple with, because it is. I mean, when you look at, so, not to get too into politics, but historically the left was the party of the working class, and it had an analysis of corporate power and a critique of the pharmaceutical industry, and something kind of flipped. And I do think it was around the kind of Obamacare era, where drug companies and kind of the health industry more broadly was very successful in conflating care and like kind of the kind-hearted intentions of people into health care. That the conflating of, being a good person, caring about other people means you want them to get access to health care and drugs, treatments. And you are questioning treatments, you're questioning people's suffering. You horrible person, you just want to see people struggle and die. And so I do think the wedding of pharmaceutical products with care in the minds of people, and the wedding of professional services and care in the minds of people, makes it really distorts a person's capacity to step back and see how they're actually participating in the very systems, like you said, that they're claiming they want to be critiquing.
That they're critical of. Yeah.
And this makes me think, and I reference him a few times in my book. I wish I could have had him on every page because of his influence on me, but the work of Ivan Illich, who wrote about so many different aspects of life, from schools to kind of like consumer products, to his book on the medical system called Medical Nemesis. This reminds me of his work, and how this system that sets out to help people and solve these problems, like in the case of the medical industry, so-called health, has actually created and worsened those very problems that it claims to treat. This is what he called medical nemesis, but you see it in so many different institutions and systems. You can make the case about school. School is meant to be a place where you learn how to think and expand your mind and develop reasoning and critical thinking capacities. And yet, at least for me, school became the opposite of that, where I just regurgitated information to get me into a good college, and literally did the opposite of think critically or be curious about anything. So his work has really influenced me in many ways, and I think he's more his work is more important for our society than ever before, I think.
That's interesting. And that might explain the question of like why, white women, more educated folks are represented so disproportionately in those who take antidepressants.
That's a good and interesting theory. Yeah, I think it's a strong one. Yeah.
And I think part of it is like, so like just getting into college and getting yourself through college and school in general, like obviously you need to have some intelligence, but part of it is agreeableness. Like your willingness to just do what the teacher tells you to do. And I think, you just transfer that same situation with a authority figure in the medical community, and you, oh yeah, okay, doc, I'll fill my prescription for these dangerous drugs. All right. And then also the Obamacare stuff. I do think it's been, they have that political strategy of like attacking somebody who's critical of it. It's like, oh, you don't care about healthcare. And I think the insurance might have another effect. Like, I think, don't get me wrong, everyone, I think there's great arguments for a universal healthcare system. But if you're seeing, hundreds of dollars exit your account, every month for health insurance, it kind of incentivizes people to be like, fuck it, I'm going to get my money's worth. I'm going to go. Yeah. And what excuse, I'm going to get I'm going to see the doctor, see what's going on. And then unfortunately, so often the doctor can lead you in a direction you didn't need to go in.
Yep.
That can end up harming you. And anyway, that you obviously showed how that can happen in your experience. Oh, and again, who's more likely to have the better insurance or be insured, right? It's the educated white women, perhaps.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, and self-care, quote unquote, has been, it's kind of thrown about like it's this, good and noble pursuit that you were kind of endlessly on this quest of self-care, which usually means consume products and services that have been marketed to you as self-care products. And so I know for me, I'm like,
that's not self-care. That's care from the big corporation for pay. I mean, right?
Yeah. Like my the kind of internal process I go through when I'm making decisions for myself is generally like, would my hunter-gatherer ancestors have done this? Like if, whether it's put this in my body, engage with my baby like this, whatever the basic thing is. And I'm like, if no, then I will, let me see what I can do here to kind of return as much as I possibly can to my human nature, which obviously we, in this modern world, we're always going to be kept from it. But as close as I can get to doing things in my day-to-day life in the way that my ancestors, pre-industrialization at least, did, it's like kind of my guidepost to the extent that I'm able to. So.
Yeah, our ancestors definitely weren't thinking with minds clouded by antipsychotics and antidepressants.
You can say that again.
Which can help the thought process, I imagine. Well, thank you for being so generous with your time. I think you've made a little impact, even at a small channel like my own. Again, thank you for coming onto a smaller channel like my own, even after, getting exposure in Washington Post and New York Times.
Oh my gosh, Matt, it's such an honor to be here. And I'm so grateful for your work over the years and all you do to reach people and get important ideas out in really unique and original ways that have been super impactful for so many people. So thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. And that reminds me there, you did come to me with an idea, and I think it's a great idea. for me or someone else out there to tackle, and that is a compilation, a media mashup of all the experts and media outlets touting how antidepressants are this miracle drug to fight a chemical imbalance, and that's how it works, and that's completely false. That is not an aspect of, that is not how they work, and that is not, a thing with the depression, at least that's been proven. Yep. And yet they talk about it and they continue to talk about it as if it hasn't been thoroughly debunked. So that's a good media mashup compilation for me or somebody else out there if someone wants to beat me to it. And I will read this last comment from Mary Rose. It says, Matt, so much of what Laura says is relatable. Getting the book.
Oh,
so beautiful.
You. Yeah, and I it's been wonderful to see comments coming through here and to like it's just all the insightful thoughts and reflections people have shared in the comments. It's been wonderful to follow them. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Well, I'll let you get back to doing your important work with the tapering and all, helping people taper. And thank you. I'll thank your husband Cooper for that video setup. It was very nice while it lasted, and thank you for having a good backup. Yeah, and audio's on your end's been great, so thank you, Cooper, for that. All right,
thanks
beautiful.
So much for having me, Matt. Really good to see you.
All right, have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Bye.